And now to another country consumed with discontent and protest, Syria. And tonight there's breaking news in Syria. Syrian President Assad addressed his people, and what he said has now enraged and even further enraged the protesters. Joined us by Skype freelance reporter John Redwine. John, what happened today? What did President Assad say to his people and the reaction?
Well, Assad spoke today. Many were expecting the repeal of the emergency laws, which have been in place for several decades now, helping the regime to put down dissent. But in fact, we didn't get anything of the sort. We got more of the same old rhetoric that we've seen from the regime over the years. Accusations that the movements are being instigated by a conspiracy theory put forward by Israel and the West. So it was really shocking disbelief in Damascus today.
If you look at the timeline and the articles that are coming out, that have been written about it, after President Assad spoke, the protests increased, and it says that protesters were shot. Is that correct? Did that happen?
Well, we've seen some reports that there were protests in Latakia and other parts of the country met with firing in the air by soldiers. I haven't seen any reports about deaths yet, but it's likely that something like that will follow. Really, it seems, though, that we'll have to wait till Friday to see what sort of large-scale response there will be to the speech.
How about the people surrounding President Assad? Is there any sort of break in that, or is the military strong and loyal to him, and the same with any security forces?
That's a great question. Syria seems to be a little bit of a different story than Egypt and Tunisia, where the military wasn't so in line with the regime. Syria has a very good control over the military and the security apparatus, so they're standing fairly strong at this point. What's interesting to note is that the regime isn't entirely on message. Hussein al-Shaban, a high advisor to Assad, suggested that there would be more reform and more development, more sort of repeal of the emergency law, etc., in Assad's speech, which we didn't see. So it's interesting to note this non-alignment in communication from the regime.
So am I correct in understanding that everybody expected you to come out and say there'd be a lot of reform, we'd get rid of some of the emergency rule? That's what the protesters expected. Instead, he came out, he didn't say that. Instead, says there's a conspiracy. It's basically Israel and the West is out to get me. And he riled up the protesters, and they have now they've gotten bigger in number, but he's got a strong security and army, so it appears, surrounding him.
That seems to be the case, yes.
What is supposed to happen? What do you anticipate happening in the next 24 hours?
Well, it's possible that there will be protests tomorrow. We don't know how the regime will respond, although it's likely that it'll be a similar response as previously, met with force. But really, again, it's Friday after prayer. It's the only time, really, in Syria where people are allowed to congregate in any numbers. That's when we'll see the true response to the speech, how people really feel. So we have to wait and see until after Friday prayers.
Is there a leader amongst the protesters, or is it much like we saw in sort of Tunisia and Egypt, that it's a collection of people, and even in Libya, but no particular leader emerging?
That's a great question. I think at this point it's really difficult to pin that down. I mean, it seems to be a sort of groundswell of support for the protesters. It's not a Facebook revolution as we think we've seen in other parts of the region. This is really people just getting together spontaneously and from different parts of the country, I might add. Some of the protests in Latakia have been within the Alawite community, which is a small sect within Syria from which the Assad dynasty hails. So it's interesting to see, really, we've got support for the protesters from different parts of the community. Sunni Arabs Sunni Muslims, and also the Alawites. So it's a unique blending of protesters, certainly.
John, thank you.
You're very welcome.